Hi there, Tracy from Kazadans Equestrian, and welcome to the second part of my Make Your Own Training Plan videos. So this is part 2, so if you haven't done so already, please go and have a look at part 1, which looks at the very first easy, simple initial steps that you need to identify before going on to this part of the training plan. Also, if you'd like any further information about how your horse responds to exercise, then there's a whole other playlist about the athletic horse and what the parts of the horse's body does in response to training and why it's so important, and also what makes them so very athletic. So let's get on to the next step of fleshing out this training plan. Obviously, what you need to do is identify what your training challenge or goal is. For example, if you are fitness training for show jumping, you need to have a think about what speeds you want to be doing, how long the horse has to be doing that for, how many rounds do you need to do, and you want the horse to be able to do this without fatiguing in the last couple of rounds of your jump. For an endurance ride, it's fairly simple. You've got a certain time and a distance that you need to do. So any of these, get that together. Make sure you know exactly what the challenge is. After this, we need to identify back to that training triangle about what is required the most of your horse. Is it stamina? Is it strength? Or is it speed? And this is going to help you determine which style of fitness training and where you're going to try and improve it the most. So remembering the difference between aerobic and anaerobic production of energy. Anaerobic is without oxygen and aerobic is with or in the presence of oxygen. Most horse sports do rely on aerobic fitness or aerobic energy production. So this is where we really do focus our energy. However, some sports do require more strength training as well. Examples of this would obviously be kart. Show jumping, for example, does require a lot more strength than is required in an endurance horse. If you need to increase your horse's aerobic capacity, which everybody does for every sport, you need to be training your horse at a heart rate of between 150 and 180 beats per minute. If you want to train your horse to produce more energy in an anaerobic fashion, which is that strength or that burst of energy, you need to then be training at heart rates above 180 beats per minute. So you can see how heart rate is your biggest marker. There's a lot of tools and a lot of gadgets you can buy to monitor your horse's heart rate and fitness. There's a lot of mathematical equations you can use, but honestly, the easiest and quickest thing for those of us who are amateur competitors or amateur riders is to grab that stethoscope and make sure you know how to take your horse's heart rate. As I mentioned, it is harder to train a horse with weights. There's no equivalent to sending your horse to the gym. So if you do need to increase strength, you're going to have to think a bit outside the square and not ignore that part of the training program. So let's say we're starting from scratch. You're pulling a horse in out of the paddock and you have an aim for a competition. How do we start? Let's remember that an unfit horse still has a really large capacity for exercise. So the first time you ride your horse isn't going to be a great indication of how fit your horse is. So no pulling them in out of the paddock, doing a big ride and saying they coped with that fine, they're going to be okay on the weekend. They will always do that because of the horse and their general athletic ability. See, the problem is the horse doesn't know your training plan. They don't know what you have planned for it on the weekend, in a month or in 2 months or even tomorrow. So they don't reserve that energy. They don't manage it. They just use the bursts of exercise and they use their athleticism to the best they can whenever it's required. So it's up to us to manage the fact that we don't want to overtrain them and balance that risk of injury versus the increase in fitness that we need. The ideal solution is that we look at increasing intensity of training to increase the fitness every 2 to 3 weeks of exercise. And how are we going to know that the horse is ready for the next stage or ready for the increase? Again, let's look at that heart rate. We need to look at how fast your horse gets back down to its normal heart rate, or at least how fast it's dropping. You can even look for things like, is it sweating as much? Does it look like it's going a little bit slower? Is it handling the distance as well or better than it was? So you've got to look for those markers in your horse. And like I said, the heart rate is going to give you the most consistent marker. And when your horse seems to be getting fitter and handling that much better, then we look at increasing the intensity of exercise. And as a rule of thumb, you're looking at every 2 to 3 weeks. Now remember, at the beginning of your training program, the horse is going to increase in fitness really quite quickly. And as you get closer to needing competition fitness, depending on how fit that is or how high the level of competition is, your training responses are going to slow down as they reach their maximum fitness. Do need to have a look at what is important for your sport, because if you equally train a horse for both stamina and strength, you won't get the ultimate stamina out of your horse, nor will you get the ultimate strength. You'll get a good all-rounder that can do all of us. And for most of us low-level competitors, that's actually probably the best outcome. If you're looking to create a training plan for a high-level endurance horse, then strength isn't going to be anywhere near as important. And if you focus too much on that, you simply won't get the maximum stamina that you can get out of your horse. So the sport that you're indulging in is really important. The reason for this is that there are 2 different types of muscle fibers involved, and you don't want to increase the amount of strength and short and strong muscle fibers. If what you want is your horse to go a long distance, you want to increase that type of muscle fiber. So now the plan, it's a really fine line and a balance between increasing the fitness properly and reducing the risk of injury due to overtraining, and also reducing your horse's willingness to work through overtraining. And again, you've got to look at your individual horse's markers. You've got to know their heart rate, and you've got to monitor these markers and know your own horse and know your own horse is normal enough to know when your horse is coping with this exercise a little bit more and how to increase the load. And how do you increase the load? Well, there's several ways you can actually do that. It's not always just going further and faster, but they are too, further and faster. You can ask your horse to carry a little bit more weight during exercise. You can change the terrain and start doing exactly the same speed and distance, but up a hill, or include hills in that program. Another way is actually to use climate to your advantage. Do the same kind of training, basically in hotter weather, will also be increasing the intensity of that level of exercise. Now we know we're looking at heart rate, we're looking at the other markers, and we're monitoring how well our horse recovers. And then we're going to increase the intensity by either speed, duration, terrain. Every 2 to 3 weeks is the aim. Now there's an individual component in this as well. Some horses are more natural at stamina, like Arabians. Some are more natural at strength. So you need to work that in to what your training program is and monitor those normal markers. The other thing that makes a difference is actually a horse's age. The maximum heart rate, it's a little bit like us. We can take the number of 220 beats per minute and take away the horse's age, and this is really the maximum heart rate that the horse should be exercising at. Again, individuals are different. This is just a rule of thumb, and it's a really good way to just start by checking, is your horse training at the heart rate that it needs to be training at? The next big thing to put in your training plan is, if you're aiming for aerobic fitness, 3 times a week is plenty. 3 times a week to increase aerobic fitness. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can't ride your horse 6 days a week, as per a lot of people's training plans go, but please, if you do not allow your horse time to recover between training bouts, that's when you increase the risk of injury quite significantly. So it's actually the recovery that helps the horse in its training equally as the program or the riding that you're doing. So if you're looking for aerobic, please make sure you're only doing or pushing that horse with the physical training aspect every other day at the most. And the other days can be behavioural training or walking or something that doesn't press the horse to stress. We only get an increase in fitness when we cause a stress load, really. It's the same as us. If we're just walking in our comfort zone, we're not increasing our fitness. So you've got to stress the horse. The fact that we have to cause stress means there is micro damage to the horse every time you're trying to increase fitness. If we do not allow your horse's muscle fibers, etc., to recover, you are risking injury. Okay, so you've got your piece of paper, you've got your goals and aims, you've got your horse's individual statistics, etc. What do you do now? So let's work for your end goal and start there and work backwards. We know where we want the horse to be. Now we know that every 2 to 3 weeks we can increase the amount of training and increase the stress load on the horse. The one little secret or the one other tip I have to give you, and I'll focus more on this in next week's video, is please allow 2 to 3 weeks at the end of that training program. You want your horse to have hit its peak fitness earlier because there's a really big advantage to tapering the training down prior to competition. So we're going to take our date or our time limit, we're going to go back a few weeks to allow for that tapering that I'll talk about later, and look for peak fitness at this point. Now we know the peak fitness could be, must be able to ride 80 kilometres, must be able to do a show jump round in this amount of time, and we need the heart recovery to be quite quick and show that fatigue isn't setting in too early. Remembering that recovery is so very important, you can map out your training days and put in specifics like walk 10 minutes, trot 10 minutes for the first week. Then we're going to increase intensity by walking 15, trotting 15, cantering 5. This is the sort of thing we're looking at doing. Remembering strength is a lot harder to do in a horse. So we want transitions. We want some interval training, maybe sprints up a hill, or even pulling extra weight or carrying extra load. These things will help the horse's strength training. Let's have a look at some of the individual English sports. Sorry about that, I'm not very Western, guys, but I'm sure you can make some kind of connection. Firstly, show jumping. Show jumping is one of those sports that actually does require quite a lot of anaerobic energy. If you were to take a horse around the show jump ring at the same pace but put all the poles on the ground, so no raised or no jumping efforts, your horse is using the majority aerobic energy. So again, that's just aerobic fitness that you want. But when you add in that jump effort, this is when the horse needs that bout of strength, and it's more likely that at this point they're using their anaerobic pathway for energy. So you don't want to have a show jumper that isn't strong. They will fatigue easily and they will drop rails and they won't be able to participate in that jump effort anywhere near as cleanly. So because we want this out of a jump horse, some of your training must be at over 180 beats per minute to start training that anaerobic pathway. Dressage, it's actually very unlikely that they'll use anaerobic pathways. I'm sure they do in some, and certainly at higher levels where they need that muscle strength. I'm not saying they don't need strength or don't use it, but they don't actually engage that anaerobic pathway as much. So it's much more emphasis on aerobic capabilities. So getting your horse out of the arena and taking it for long trail rides not only helps its mental health, but helps increase that aerobic fitness, which is going to increase your performance. An unfit horse to a horse that's going to be able to participate in a medium level dressage for you, skill training aside, that's very different. I'm only talking about fitness here, should really only take you between 12 and 16 weeks. So if you've got a dressage competition, remember allowing for the 2-week taper, work backwards, and you should be 3 to 4 months, you should be able to get your horse nicely, comfortably fit enough to not fatigue through your test. Okay, so then we have the crazy eventers. You've got such a challenge here with your horse's fitness because you need that aerobic strength for the cross-country run. You need the anaerobic strength for the jumping efforts in the cross-country. And also, you need a lot of anaerobic pathway available to your horse because at the end of cross-country, it still needs to be strong enough to clear those jumps. So it's a lot harder to find the balance between the anaerobic and aerobic pathways. And if you remember what I said earlier, if you focus too much on one, you will do that to the detriment of the other. So with an event horse, this balance is incredibly important. So those people who go out eventing without a training plan, without including your sprints, your intervals, your weight or hill work for strength, as well as your stamina, you will be doing your horses disservice. If you do too much aerobic activity, they may get through their cross country, but it's quite likely that if your horse is dropping rails, every time it gets to the show jump phase at the end, it's probably fatigued. This means you need to work a little bit more on the strength and a little bit less on the aerobic capability of your horse. And this is a really tricky balance to get. That most event horses are actually being trained at a much lower intensity than their competition work. This is really important. It's no wonder we get dropped show jumping rails if the horse simply isn't fit enough to compete at that level. Quite often we get an adrenaline rush cross country, so all of those wonderful athletic capabilities just, spark on into the horse to get you through cross country. Give it a little bit of a rest and we get to show jumping and they're like, I'm done. So they'll do it for you out of obedience, but if you want that bouncy, clear round right at the end, make sure that they have trained at the right intensity and the equal amount of aerobic and anaerobic training. Again, remember 3 days a week. At least alternate your aerobic training with your anaerobic training to allow the horse's recovery. If they don't get this recovery, they will have an injury. The injury may not be a big dramatic one for you, but the injury may be a real lack in performance and you have no idea why, but the muscles are so fatigued with micro tears, the horse needs its recovery. So the 4 biggest take-home messages from today's video is 1, recovery. If you do not allow your horse recovery time, it will bite you later on. Number 2, heart rate, heart rate, heart rate. If you don't know how to take your horse's heart rate, haven't been taking it, please have a look at the video on taking heart rate and get to know that. It's your best friend when it comes to training your horse. Number 3, make sure your balance between aerobic and anaerobic training is suited to the sport you want to participate in. And the last one, which I'll expand a bit again on next week, is actually make sure you allow the taper off time prior to competition. Thanks. I hope that was helpful for you. Feel free to ask any questions. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Click like on the video as well and add any comments you like, and I'll see you next week.